Why I took this particular topic was, of course, that everybody has written on Ashoka. In fact, when I was interviewed for the PhD program, they asked me what I wanted to work on, and I mentioned this, and there was a general groan amongst all the historians who said, "Oh, not another study. There's so many of them already." And I explained that my interest was a different interest. And what was my interest? It was that I didn't want to treat him the way in which every nationalist historian or even colonial historian had. That is, Vincent Smith, R.K. Mukherjee, and all the others that had written on him, where he was an isolated figure. Smith talked about him being a monk and a monarch and a myth at the same time. Others talked about him as being the great creator of, the Hindu age, even though he was a Buddhist and that kind of thing. And for me, the important thing was, how does one, there were two questions. One was the question that was being widely discussed then, the individual in history. What makes history? Is it the individual? Then you get an individual who is clearly very different from the other kings of that time. He's doing something which is quite extraordinary. I mean, I didn't realize then how extraordinary it is until in later years, when I read much more history, I began to see that this really was someone who was a very extraordinary person. And then the basic question also was, is history created by an individual, or is it the historical context that the historian has to look at? And so my attempt was to place this particular ruler in a historical context. And the fundamental issue was the Dhamma of Ashoka, where everybody had said this was Buddhism, that he was propagating Buddhism. And I kept reading the edicts again and again and saying, it doesn't sound like the propagation of Buddhism. It sounds like he's trying to persuade people, he's trying to direct people, he's trying to suggest to people that this is what they should be doing. Not in the sense of a religious missionary, but much more in terms of someone who feels that he has an idea of how life should be lived and what the story should be. So I was terribly interested in the notion of how you put the man and his ideas into the context of history. And that was really what motivated me. What is interesting is that when my book on Ashoka was published in 1961, it was greeted by some historians in India with, my God, this is a totally new way of looking at this subject. We thought there was nothing new to say on it, and this has opened up possibilities of looking at the Ashokas, the Chandraguptas, the Akbars, everybody, in a different kind of light. That was one reaction. The other reaction was one of a certain amount of hostility, because I remember the one phrase that I used in my conclusion, where I talked about certain megalomaniacal tendencies of the king in his edicts. And this upset a lot of people who, one doesn't talk about great kings of the past in that kind of strain. Whereas I was saying that if you read the later edicts where he's claiming to have done this, that, and the other, there is a trace of this. And it makes perfectly good sense that when a person is an emperor and is trying to persuade people to a different way of thinking and acting and behaving and so on, if you think at the end of your 26 years of reign that you have succeeded, then there is an element of that. But it certainly created a tension. When I was in school, I was torn between three subjects that I thought were absolutely gripping. One was history, one was literature, and the third was botany. And I actually wanted to be a botanist. But I was dissuaded from this for a multiple set of irrelevant reasons, which I sometimes regret now. So I spent my time reading much more on history and literature. Now, I finished school at the end of 1947. We had just become independent. And during that period of the 40s, the big impact on all of us was the national movement. And I was in school in Pune. Gandhi was in prison in Pune. And each time he was released, he used to have these prayer meetings, and we'd all trot off there to listen to him. And there was a kind of intensity in the air, which is very, very difficult to describe. I mean, life has never been the same. Public life has never been the same since. And so there was this feeling of a national movement. There was this feeling of who are we, what are we going to do with ourselves? You know, independence is imminent and it's about to come, and so on. And then at the end of 47, I took my school leaving exam, and I had 6 months free before I could join university, because the university term starts in June. This was a period when my father suddenly developed a tremendous interest in South Indian bronze sculpture. So he would come back with these vast tomes and sit and read Hindu iconography, Indian bronze sculpture, classical sculpture, and so on. And after about a month of this, he said one day, I can't just go on reading this by myself. I need to have somebody to talk to over dinner. And my mother immediately opted out and said, not me. So I was left reading these stones and talking to him. And gradually, over the course of 6 months, I was hooked. And that was my initial entry into doing something that had to do with the remote past as we saw it then. And this led to sort of learning Sanskrit at home and getting more and more interested in it. Though the toss-up was between history and literature all the time. And finally, when I did do my BA honours, I did it in literature. And when I got to the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, they said, no, you have to repeat your BA honours because you can't do research in history unless you have an honours in history. So that was how I became an undergraduate again and did my BA honours in London, and then went on to do a PhD. The idea of the Shakunthala book came about after I'd retired, but nevertheless the conversations have continued. Began really with something that I did, when was it now, way back. I did a study of different versions of the Ram Katha. 1978, I gave a lecture in Bangalore at the Mythic Society, where I talked about 3 different versions: the Valmiki version, the Buddhist Jataka stories that pick up the story of Ram in 2 or 3 contexts, and the Jain version. And I was very struck by how totally different these versions were. I mean, the Buddhist version, for example, one Jataka story, the famous Dasarat Jataka, is a story in which Ram and Sita are brother and sister. And this is a great compliment, because in the Buddhist origin myth concept, tracing yourself back to sibling incest is considered the purest lineage that you could have. So I was interested in the way in which these different religious ideologies had used the same story. And in the Jain tradition, for example, they're all Jains. And the great qualities are the qualities that are associated with the best of the Jain patriarchs and teachers and so on. And I had done this little, I'd taken up things like the geography is different, the locations are different, the societies they're describing are quite different. The Ramayana has the Rakshas, who are much more like chiefdoms, and the society of Ayodhya, which is much more a monarchical society. And I was arguing that the Ramayana at one level is the conflict between chiefdoms and monarchies, which was a very real conflict in the middle of the 1st millennium BC. And then you get the Jain version, which is written in about approximately the 3rd century AD, where the whole of the Vindhyan region, which had earlier been forested, is now full of kingdoms, and exile is traveling from one kingdom to another, and it's quite an interesting variation. So I had done that and got rather interested in this notion of how a narrative is transmuted at different historical points in time. And of course, after I had retired, my great aim, which I have not been able to meet as yet, was to sit and read poetry and listen to music. But of course that didn't happen. But I think that my initial interest in literature seemed to surface at that point. And that was when I got interested in this, the Shakunthala idea. It started off with Kali for Women were celebrating their 10th anniversary. And they said to me, would I do a talk? And I said, well, you know, my students all attack me for not being a feminist. And the best of them, some of them who are now the best feminist historians, one of them in particular, who was my student, used to say, why don't you take an interest in this? You know, your history is so devoid of feminism. And I said, I had never done anything of this kind. And they said, no, no, think about it. You might be able to do something. Think of possible ideas. And I had once, some years ago, given a little lunchtime seminar on the difference between the story of Shakunthala in the Mahabharata and Kalidas's version. And it was a slightly superficial thing, but you know, I'd done it as a kind of fun seminar. So I went back to that theme and I looked at it, and there was certainly an enormous difference between the way in which the story is treated in the epic and the way in which Kalidasa treats it. Then that led on to some other treatments of it in semi-folk literature, like the Kathasaritsagar and so on. And then there was the case of the translation by William Jones, the translation into German, Goethe taking it up, and how it becomes an icon in the German Romantic movement. Then it bounces back into India in the 19th century, and there is this whole debate about, is it erotic? Should it be taught in colleges? Or should we remove Act 3, which is the erotic act, and cleanse it and then allow it to be taught? Everybody agreeing that Kalidas's drama was, in fact, the best bit of creative literature in Sanskrit. That there was general agreement on that, but there was this little problem of this. And then there is this fascinating essay by Rabindranath Tagore, you know, where he talks about how there's a difference between physical love and spiritual love. And he talks about, he uses the term patita, where Shakuntala is said to fall, as it were. There's a fall in her status and her way, because she gave in to the Gandharva marriage, which she should not have done. And therefore the separation is a penance, and finally there is a union. And my argument through all of this was, we have taken Shakuntala as an icon from the Kalidas version, but we never go back to the Mahabharata version, where she is a much more spirited, free, independent, feisty woman. And so this was my contribution, in a sense, to feminism. But no, it was more than that. It was that I was really genuinely interested in this whole question of how you can take a narrative, or later on, as in the case of Somnath, take an event, and see how it is treated historically, which tells you something about the history of the time in which that treatment is being made. So it's another way of entering history. London in the late 50s was a place that was, for me at least, the center of the universe. It was just milling with ideas and people and theories and so on. Even a place like SOAS, which was, after all, in those days, a kind of wing of the colonial office, as it were, I remember there was tremendous excitement when K.M. Panikar's book came out, Asia and Western Dominance, because this was the first time it was said that an Asian historian had questioned the views of European colonial dominance in Asia. And there were lots of discussions on this book and so on. And I think I was rather lucky at that point because the people I got to know in the field, one was my tutor, Professor Basham, who then became my supervisor when I went on to do a PhD, a man with immensely open views, who was part Indologist, but in part also questioned the basis of Indology. And he was the person who also was responsible for inviting Didi Kosambi, in those days quite unknown to academia, to come to London and to give a series of 8 lectures on what is Hinduism. And you can imagine what Kosambi did with that theme and how all of us were just initially flabbergasted. And after that, suddenly realized that there was something to this story of the past which was much more exciting and stimulating than what we had sort of read about in standard books and so on, and worth exploring. Having had an undergraduate training at London University, where we were encouraged to, if not actually take up courses in other areas, to certainly sit in. And I used to wander around to University College and sit in at lectures on classical history and talk to people. I had friends who were students of history in University College and King's College and so on, who were studying classical history, so I was somewhat aware of it. And the other thing was that, you know, this idea of London being the center of the universe, one of the things that brought this home to me was that I knew absolutely nothing about China when I arrived in London, because China is not a kind of area, ancient China, is not the kind of area that is included in Indian studies. Even if I'd done a history honors, it wouldn't have been on, ancient China would not have been part of the degree. And there was offered in an associated institution a course on Chinese art and archaeology, a diploma course, an evening course. And I suddenly thought to myself, gosh, this is an area I know nothing about. Why don't I just sit in on this course? I mean, it was not for a degree. It was simply to make myself aware of another civilization. So I did that, and that was part of the reason why I became aware of what was happening to the east of the Indian subcontinent. And as it turned out, it came in extremely useful, because in 1957, a friend of mine who had done a little bit of work on Buddhist art in China got an invitation to come to China and to work at 2 sites, Maichisang and Dunhuang, the famous Dunhuang in the Gobi Desert. And I had done a little bit of research for her, helped her as a research assistant. And I suddenly got this call from Paris saying, would you like to come as my research assistant? And I had these 5 months in China, 1 month in Dunhuang, 1 month in Maichisang, where all that I had casually sat and imbibed in this course came in very useful. But the point that I'm trying to make is that there is something to be said for being somewhere where things are accessible, where you can go outside your field. And if you have that interest, you can, you know, acquire information and knowledge and so on much more easily than I could have done it if I had been sitting in Delhi. My experience of those years was something that did make a very deep impact on me, because not only the accessibility of other regions, but for example, archaeology. I became very aware of archaeology in London, again because one was going in and out of the Institute of Archaeology and being encouraged to take an interest in that subject as a necessary part of training in ancient Indian history. So that when we started thinking of courses at the JNU, one of the things I was determined was that, you know, particularly for the ancient history specializations, that you try and push the broadening of the mind as much as possible. We started a course called Ancient Society, where we went from the general concepts from prehistory to Bronze Age. And then we got students to work on ancient Mesopotamia, on Greco-Roman history, which was a compulsory course for all history students. And the idea was very much that, you know, you don't say that the only history in the world I know is my own history. My conversations were certainly with all kinds of people in all kinds of situations, and you know, this has been one of the excitements of being in the field of writing history. But some of my best conversations have also been with colleagues in the JNU, the History Center. And that is something that, I mean, the 1970s and the 1980s, the 20 years that I was there, were great years in my life, not simply in terms of helping to build this center, but also in terms of the kinds of discussions and conversations that we had. Delhi University was a very interesting experience for me at that time, because one had witnessed the gradual shift of Indian history from Indology towards more sort of purely historical writing in London. That was beginning then. You know, we were reading Ranke, for example, and we were beginning to look at sources in a different way and so on. And then at Delhi at that time, there was this great efflorescence of anthropologists, sociologists, economists, demographers, the whole sort of group of people that constituted the social sciences. And they would ask one questions about what was it like earlier on. Did you have this kind of situation in the early period? When does it change? When does it begin? These were questions we'd never asked. Caste, for example. I remember conversations with M.N. Srinivas where he would say to me, well, you know, this is how it is. This is my interpretation of caste now. Now, can you tell me how far back in time we can take it? And I would say, gosh, I'll have to think about it and, you know, do some research on it, because this is not the kind of social history that we were brought up on. I mean, the realization that when one talks about caste in history, one doesn't simply go on repeating what the Dharmashastras say about the Varna system. One talks about jatis. This in itself was a revelation for a lot of historians at that time. People had written about jatis, but not in the context of, you know, this is part of social history. So that's the kind of thing, or things like economic history. Nobody had really discussed in any detail whether there were changes of economic systems. You know, did you have agrarian systems changing? Did you have the rise and decline of trade? What impact did this have? What about urbanization? All of these were new ideas. So that was really what was shifting. I mean, there was another shift going on from nationalist history as such to history as a social science, which meant new questions, new ways of looking at it, and distancing oneself again from the generalizations of the nationalist historians. I would say that the two major influences in my case were thinking about Marxist historiography and thinking about the French Annales school and reading effectively around that. Marxist historiography, this was again the early 60s when everybody was talking about how inappropriate the Asiatic mode of production was. We were all writing to show up the faultiness of this particular mode of production, which meant the inevitable question that if you say that this is not applicable to India, are any of the other modes of production applicable? And so, you know, there was, for a short time, a serious question of was there a slave mode of production, which had been pushed by Dange. dreadful, really the worst kind of Marxist historical writing imaginable. But of course, very soon superseded by perhaps the most creative Marxist historical writing to date, which was Didi Kosambi's first his introduction to the study of Indian history, and then Culture and Civilization in its historical outline. And Kosambi was certainly very influential. A number of us were influenced by him. In my case, as I said, I mean, my first contact with him was in London when he was giving these lectures, and then came back and read his book and so on, studied it very carefully. And the questions that he raised were questions that were in the air at that time. That, you know, if you're not using the stages that Marx suggested, is there any legitimacy in using the method, but coming to different stages? And this is where the French Marxist thinking also entered the scene, you know, structural Marxism, humanistic Marxism. And up to a point, some of my studies of the lineage side, in from lineage to state, was quite deeply influenced by French structural Marxism. But the other big influence was the Annales school. And that was, for me, really a very good way of asking analytical questions of cultural and religious history. I remember my excitement at reading Marcel Maus's Gift, and suddenly realizing that one could perhaps analyze, as I then went on to do in an essay, the ritual of sacrifice and gift-giving in those terms. And this was really extremely exciting, and I remember the first time I used the word potlatch and the kind of commotion it created with people saying, you know, what's that? what are these newfangled ideas that you're introducing? But for me, it was something that seemed to tie the thing together very neatly. And I'm glad to see that later on as we went along. Or, for example, when I started giving my first few lectures at JNU on a course that was called Literature and Society, and I asked the students to read certain hymns from the Rig Veda that had to do with cattle keeping, and read Evans Pritchard on the Nuer, the East African cattle keepers, and see whether they could make any connections in terms of, are we talking about similar societies? And if we're talking about similar societies, then what are the kinds of questions that we should ask our sources? And what are the answers that we're coming up with? And I was delighted to discover a few years later this book by Bruce Lincoln, which is doing exactly that. It's taking the Avastha and the Rig Veda and the work that was done on cattle keepers in Africa and making analyses. Now, I think that this was very important, not simply in terms of a comparative method, that is, that you take up what is said about one society. And in the old days, of course, you would look at two societies and say, this was better than that, or this was earlier than that. Not that way. You take up the study of a society, which is not the one that you're actually studying, and you find out what are the questions that people are asking. And then you see whether you can ask the same questions. Is it legitimate to ask those questions? What are the answers that the other society's study is revealing? Are the answers that you're getting in any way similar? And then what are the conclusions that you can come up with? So it was a kind of comparative method at the same time, but a comparative method that was using comparative disciplines like social and cultural anthropology and economic anthropology and that kind of thing. Now, this was beginning to happen in the 60s with me. And then when I moved to JNU and we set up the History Center there, and we had this galaxy of bright young historians, I found that a lot of these questions that I was asking were being echoed by them as well. Sometimes they were modern historians, sometimes they were ancient historians, but there was an immense discussion that started, and that was one of the things that then led me beyond just looking at the purely material basis to arguing that even the cultural history has to be much more nuanced. The first time that I started questioning the 19th century notion of civilizations was precisely when I was doing this kind of comparative study. Because it was not so much that you were taking an African society or, you know, even the Polynesian societies of that time and saying, can we use the same forms of this is not to say that the societies were the same. It was to say that there are phases in social history which may be throwing up the same kinds of ideas and behavior patterns, which can perhaps be understood better if we look at contemporary studies of societies of a different kind, with similar characteristics, but of different areas. And that automatically, once you start doing that, the barriers of the civilizations break down. I mean, the barriers had already begun to break down in my mind. For example, when I realized that you have in Asia 3 major civilizations by the 19th century reckoning. You have West Asia, which is described as Islamic, with a literature in Arabic. You have South Asia, which is described as Hindu, with a literature in Sanskrit. And you have China, which is described as Confucian, with a literature in Chinese. And I asked myself, where does Buddhism come into all of this? It drops out of India, because it anyway dropped out. And it's not picked up in China, because China can't have the same religion as India. It has to have a different religion, so it's Confucianism. And there you have a very major, but major articulation of culture and society over many centuries, which doesn't find a place in this pattern of civilizations. So that was one thing that made me sort of say, well, are we really correct in talking about civilizations? Do we really have to see the world in these terms? The other thing that made me question the concept of civilizations was, of course, when one realized that in some of the major areas of knowledge, whether it was astronomy, mathematics, medicine, there's been a zigzagging. You know, Hellenistic Indian ideas travel across to the Arab world. The Arabs resuscitate Greek ideas and then take them all off to the European world. On the other side, it goes off to the Chinese world. So why are we talking about these territorially bound civilizations? And much of this kind of history then, which now I see as sort of multiple little globalizations of the past, do militate against the notion of well-defined civilizations with particular itemized characteristics. So that, yes, that also came into it. There were 2 aspects at that stage which interested me. One was the consciousness of state formation as a process, which I began to think about in terms of this particular period of around the middle of the first millennium BC, partly also because people like Eisenstadt had talked about the axial age and the revival of the axial age, and one had had conversations with them as well in discussions, and so all these things were beginning to sort of come together. And the coming together in my mind was to look at the possibility of the process of state formation at this time. And it struck me, of course, as being a very valuable process to investigate, because it's not a once and for all process. And this led me to think in terms of how in later periods, given a different social and economic context, you would have a different kind of state formation, but the notion of the formation of states would be a continuous thing. And this was also the time when I began to reconsider the nature of the Mauryan administration and the Mauryan Empire, where I then argued, I gave the Dioskar lectures at Calcutta, and was accused of revisionism, because I was arguing that the Mauryan administration has to be seen in terms of 3 patterns that were integrated but nevertheless were distinct. One was the pattern of the metropolitan state, as I called it, which was the hub of the empire. It was the imperial state. The second was what I called the core regions, provincial capitals and their hinterlands, as it were, or umlands, to use the more correct phrase, and peripheral areas where the Mauryan administration had come in but hadn't actually taken over those areas and was merely creaming off the revenue in kind, such as forested areas. And there was, of course, a substantial amount of forest in the Mauryan period, as we know from the sources. So I was arguing that even in an imperial system, one has to consider the possibilities of different patterns of administration within the same administrative structure. And what I had argued in 1961 in my book on Ashoka and the Decline of the Mauryas, that there was a highly centralized bureaucracy which was uniform right through virtually the subcontinent, I was going back on that. When I went back to Delhi in the early 60s and started teaching at Delhi University, I had by then agreed to write the history of India, the Penguin history, the first volume. Very worried because having signed the contract on a great high, I then realized what it meant. And it was really very sobering to feel that at that sort of point in the beginning of one's career, one was setting out to do what most people do at the end of their career. Anyway, the Penguin Project was a project in which, first of all, it was a history of India. And I was very aware of the fact that most of the previous histories of India had been written very much from a North Indian point of view, the Ganges Valley perspective. So I had to do a lot of reading on South Indian history, and then later on, for the later periods, on Bengal and Eastern India and so on. So there was this notion that if one is writing a history of India, it has to be the history of the subcontinent, and all of the subcontinent has to be brought in. The second thing I wanted to do was to move away from political events and personalities alone to, again, doing something on the social and economic history and the cultural history. And not only bringing that in, together with what in those days was the great catchphrase, continuity and change. Everybody was talking about continuity and change. And so this was something that was important. But at the same time, integrate the different aspects of history. That is, that if there is a campaign that one is talking about, one has to talk about the economics of the campaign, one has to talk about who's involved, one has to talk about the consequences of the campaign, not simply in terms of territory, but in terms of other events that took place. This was also the period, of course, when the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan series had started coming out, where everything was neatly compartmentalized. You had political history, and then you had social history, economic history, literature, philosophy, art and architecture, each a separate chapter, totally unconnected. And in a sense, this was also what Basham had done in The Wonder That Was India. I mean, I admire that book enormously, but I think it was a little too separated. And my intention was to show the linkages. That, you know, why is it that the stupa style goes out and a Hindu temple replaces it? Why is it that the Hindu temple, which starts off as a very basic structure of a shrine room and an entry portal, suddenly, not suddenly, but over the years, develops into a very complex structure with multiple rooms and multiple courtyards and multiple shrines and so on? And what is it actually saying? It's not just a temple, its importance is not just architecture. It's also making statements. The kinds of things that we now take for granted, that the temple is a political statement, it's a fiscal center, it's a sacred site, it's, you know, various other things. This was something that was unheard of in those days, and one was inching towards that. and trying to bring all of that in as well. So there was a link between the two in terms of the importance of social and economic history. But at the same time, there was an attempt to correlate cultural history with social and economic and political history in a more integrated fashion. We organized a felicitation seminar for my colleague, Professor Champak Lakshmi, who was retiring. And we thought, what should be the theme? And someone suggested sacred geography, because she'd done a lot of work on that kind of thing. And of course, 25 of us got together. And I discovered practically everybody had a pet temple or a river or a god or a site somewhere, and could quite happily write on sacred geography. The one person that didn't was me. And I kept thinking to myself, what shall I do? What shall I do? I must do something because of the person for whom the seminar was. And finally decided, really almost accidentally, that why don't I do a little historiographical thing on how the Temple of Somnath and the raid on the Temple of Somnath is reflected in a few sources. So I spoke to my colleague Muzaffar Alam and said, what about the Persian sources? And he says, I can help you with that, because I couldn't read them in the original. And that was when I was at Penn, I went down to the library and said, I'd like to read all the Sanskrit inscriptions that deal with Somnath, of which there were very many. So I read those. And initially, my attempt was simply to suggest that an event occurred and you had 3 different kinds of sources that referred to the aftermath, either of the event or of the place. And they tell different stories. So the first time when I presented it at the seminar, I stopped at 1500 and merely spoke about the Persian texts, the Sanskrit inscriptions, and the Jain tradition. That was all. What was nice about working on this particular theme was that each time I went to a body of sources, something new turned up and gave a different twist to what I was trying to investigate. So there was, first of all, the Turco-Persian sources, and I began to say, well, the way in which the early period people describe the raid is very different from the way in which people later on describe the raid. Why did this difference come in? Then I went to the Sanskrit inscriptions, and there's a great deal on Somnath, whereas we had been told that the temple virtually disappears from mention anywhere, and yet there is a lot of material, one of which is this very interesting legal document of a Persian trader in the 13th century being given a plot of land to build a mosque, and the land belonged to the estates of the Somnath temple, and the priests of the temple were party to this decision and happily gave this plot of land. And I thought, this was a strange kind of decision to take if, in fact, you were suffering from the after effects of a deeply traumatic raid on the temple. And then there were the Jain texts who kept saying, you know, the really important thing was that Kumarapala Chaulukya rebuilt the temple, and it was to the glory of Jainism because this miracle occurred in the precincts of the temple, and it became a kind of Jain-Shaiva rivalry over what was the significance of the temple. So anyway, I gave this as a kind of, you know, 3 ways. But what was interesting me at that time was that how do the representations of an event then color the history of that event as we are now writing it? And I was struck by the fact that all of this material was well known, it was published. People working on the Turco-Persian chronicles had written their version of the story. Other people working on the Sanskrit inscriptions had taken the inscriptions individually and written on one inscription and another inscription, but never sort of really put them all together. And another group of scholars had written on the Jain text without correlating it in any way to the Turco-Persian or the raid or anything of that kind. And I began to say, now look, you've got these very clear representations, and why haven't we as historians brought these representations into our narrative of Somnath? After I'd given this seminar, some of my colleagues in modern history said to me, but you know, the story continues. There is this, in the 19th century, there is this proclamation of the gates made by the Governor-General Ellenborough, which relates directly to Mahmud and Somnath and so on. And there was a big debate in the House of Commons. So I started reading that. And absolutely fascinated, because this was the first time I was doing any serious reading of modern history. And I began to consult with people who'd worked on Central Asia and so on, and they gave me further stuff to read on British versions of the Afghan wars and what happened in Ghazni after that, and the background to the Ellenborough Proclamation, which also involved Ranjit Singh and the Sikh state and so on. And then I was terribly struck by the fact that reading the House of Commons debate, which was an extensive debate, where the positions pro and against Ellenborough were very strong, those that were hostile to Ellenborough's position and disapproved of the Proclamation of the Gates. The Proclamation of the Gates, by the way, was that he asked his British General Lord North in Afghanistan when he was coming back from Afghanistan, to bring back the wooden gates from the mausoleum of Mahmud of Ghazni, which gates supposedly had been looted by him from the Somnath temple and taken to Ghazni. Now, no historian refers to the gates, so where the story of the gates originated, one doesn't know. But Lord Ellenborough, the Governor-General, said to Lord North, please bring back these gates, which Lord North did. And it was this that caused the debate in the House of Commons, should he have done so. And those that were opposed to Ellenborough said, oh, he's propagating or he's supporting a native religion, which they called Lingaism. Shaivism was called Lingaism. And that it's a monstrous religion, it's the worship of the phallic, and how can he possibly do this, and it's disgusting, and he should be reprimanded for doing this. This is not a Christian act at all. Those that were supporting him said, no, what he's actually doing is that he's taking revenge for the raid of Mahmud of Ghazni, which raid had created a trauma in the minds of the Hindus because it had been such a severe attack on one of their holiest shrines. And I began to look at this debate and say, but this is exactly what later on some nationalists and religious nationalists are saying. So who started this story? And slowly came to the conclusion that the notion of the Hindu trauma and this revenge of almost 1,000 years was something that really came out of this debate in the House of Commons. And I then went on to read K.M. Munshi on the subject and realized that his book, Somnath, the Shrine Eternal, in which he argues for the need to rebuild the temple of Somnath, which they actually did, echoes again and again this debate in the House of Commons. So then I began to look at it as a problem not just in the representation up to the 15th century, but the continuing and different representation. What does colonial policy do to this representation? Because the colonial historians are only reading the Turco-Persian sources. They're not reading the Sanskrit inscriptions, although some of them had actually edited those inscriptions, but they're not relating those inscriptions to these sources, nor are they relating the Jain texts to these sources. So they're just reading one set of sources and saying, oh yes, there was this raid, and it was an act of great hostility on the part of Mahmud, because all the Muslim chroniclers have praised him to the skies, and have talked about how other sultans repeatedly destroyed the temple, and killed 50,000 infidels and converted 50,000 infidels, and the figure was always 50,000. And so this fed into colonial policy, which was that Indian society consists of these two communities, the Hindu and Muslim. They've always been antagonistic. So then I went on to look at what happened at the time of independence when Munshi demanded that the temple be rebuilt. Nehru was totally against it and said this should not be an act of the government of India, and finally succeeded in ensuring that it was built by a private trust and not by the government of India, and the whole issue of the secular state and society entered and became a central issue. And then, of course, more recently, the attempt to invoke that trauma and that spirit with the Rath Yatra from Somnath to Ayodhya, and eventually, of course, the destruction of the Babri Masjid. And I was very struck by the fact how something that we have always taken for granted, that there was this trauma, that there was this hurt memory, right from the time when Mahmud actually invaded the temple to now, was really the very deliberate creation of a so-called collective memory in the 19th century. And so I've called the book The Many Voices of the History, because yes, then it goes on to a different dimension, which is that of the popular perception of Mahmud. There is another tradition where a nephew of his, a supposed nephew of his, who was a great conqueror, comes along, is disgusted by Mahmud's conquest, and becomes himself a holy man, the famous Ghazi Mian, who is worshipped all over North India and is still worshipped. He has a shrine at a place called Bahraich in UP. So that, and the story about him is very interesting, because here's this man who is so accepted as a folk hero that his death is due to the fact that as he is about to go to his wedding ceremony, the two members of the Ahir community, who were cattle-keeping people, Nand and Jashoda, come to him and say that the Hindu Raja is killing the cows and you must come and save our cows. They were a community of cattle keepers. And he goes out to save their cows and is killed. So this is a complete reversal of the usual cow protection thing, that the Muslims kill the cows and the Hindus always protested against the Muslims killing the cows. And then the third bit of folk literature that I brought in was something that a friend of mine had written an article on, a tantric tradition, the Shavara Tantra, where in fact Mahmud is again described as a holy man himself. Mahmud of Ghazni, he's called the Turk, and he's called, which is the Turk, and he is referred to in various contexts, but one of the contexts is that when you want to invoke the holy man against an obstacle, then you take the name of various holy men, some of whom are Hindu and some are Muslim, but among these names is Mahmud of Ghazna. So the argument that I was making was that people perceive events and personalities in different ways, and consequently, if a historian is trying to understand how that event or that person is represented, it is necessary to go into all these different ways, and these different ways again have a context. Back again to this whole question of the event that is seen from the court chronicles of the Turkish courts, is seen from the local gentry, as it were, of Somnath in the Sanskrit inscriptions, is seen from the court texts of the Jain court of the Chaulukyas, is seen from folk literature and Rajput epics and so on and so forth. And Therefore, the event is a very complicated event. It's not something where you can make one generalization and say that's it. It's complicated, it's nuanced, and it's telling you a great deal about not only the different points of time when these stories were put together, these narratives were put together, but also what they're trying to say. They're trying to say very different things. I'm trying to make a distinction between what I call embedded history, which is the kind of information about the past that is not consciously about the past. It's just there. It may be serving another purpose, but it is information about the past. And then what I call embodied history, where there is a conscious effort to say, this is what happened in the past. And what I'm interested in is how does the latter look at the former? What does it draw from the past and incorporate? For example, if you take a chronicle, the Vamshavali, in what way is the author of the Vamshavali looking at the past? Which is the past that he's drawing from and incorporating into the chronicle? Why is he doing it? And what is the function of that past? This is really what I'm trying to investigate. This is a role that I never thought I would be playing. I've always thought of myself as being a sort of quiet, retiring historian. It comes really out of an interesting departure that I think took place precisely in the period that I was talking about, the 60s and 70s, which is the increased professionalization of history. Earlier, you could quite happily be a historian if you, A, knew the language, you'd read all the secondary sources, and then you argued your position. And which is why you had all these classic statements from the 1920s and 30s about how the historian is a judge and sits in judgment on the past, or the historian is a judge who sifts the truth from the falsehood, and so on. These are attitudes to history that I, for one, would find unacceptable, because I think the historian is not a judge of the past. The historian is trying to understand the past. And I would emphasize the word understand, because I think one can't really go beyond trying to understand the past. And in this process of understanding then, the way in which history has got professionalized is that, first of all, we have a much more technical interest in sources. Again, with regard to early Indian history, there was a time when you could take one quotation from the Mahabharata and one quotation from a 10th century inscription and equate the two and say, therefore. Whereas now you not only can't do that, there is a time gap which you have to consider as significant, but you have to then contextualize both sources and say the Mahabharata is a source which has these problems. And so if I take this statement from the Mahabharata, I have to be aware of these problems, whereas the inscription has these problems. And so it's become much more technical. And with the entry of, for example, things like statistics and fieldwork in archaeology and the whole scientific turn of archaeology, for example, it's not easy. You really have to, you can't be the kind of historian that sweeps across from one period to the next quite happily, and you tend to specialize much more. Now, with the professionalization of history, therefore, what has also come about is the formulation of something which we vaguely call the historical method. There is a way in which you write history. There's a way in which you tackle sources. There's a way in which you set out a hypothesis, and then you start checking your hypothesis and the logic and rationality of the argument that you use, the causation that you bring into play, the priorities that you give to your causes. All of these are extremely important, and that is really what determines the professional historian from someone who's merely writing a narrative. Therefore, the reason why some of us are very concerned, I mean, there are two reasons. One is that the kind of history that is very often put forward by the Hindutva ideologue is a history which is not professional. It is more myth, or myth history as it's sometimes called. There's a great deal of belief, and this came to the surface when the whole debate on the supposed Ram temple beneath the Babri Masjid became an important historical issue. And that was really when one became, as it were, a public intellectual, because it was felt that it was an attack on professional history. It was a demeaning of professional history to say it doesn't really matter, it's a matter of belief. And if we believe that there was a temple, then we are going to go out and accept that there was a temple. Whereas the historians, many of the historians at least, were saying, well, what is your evidence? You give us the evidence first. And this was not forthcoming. So one is the attack on professional history, which makes one counter the kind of the attempt to put across the kind of history that Hindutva is trying to do. The other is, of course, the much more widespread question of the politics of Hindutva. If this kind of Hindutva history is aimed at what it is aimed at, which is the primacy of the Hindu and the primacy of the Hindu citizen, and Hindu majoritarian rule replacing democracy, then one is opposed to it as a democrat and as a secular intellectual. So there's that side of it as well. In the 1960s, UNESCO asked about 5 or 6 of us to do a project on evaluating the history textbooks in the Union Territory of Delhi, which we did, and found them to be absolutely appalling, but really terrible. So we submitted our report to UNESCO, and UNESCO sent it on to the Ministry of Education. And the then minister was Chagla, Mr. Chagla, who was a lawyer, a very well-known lawyer from Bombay. And Mr. Chagla sent for us and said, "You've submitted this report and I'm very disturbed by it. What can we do?" And we said, rewrite the textbooks or have new textbooks, whichever way. But how do we do this? And we said, well, you must involve professional historians, because most of these textbooks have been written by goodness knows who, but not by professional historians. Well, some school teachers and some people who were not even teaching history. They were just people who, out of interest, wrote a textbook. And of course, there was a lot of money in textbooks, and textbooks were prescribed also in a convoluted fashion. It was more a sort of body of people who got together and said, this looks nice, we'll use it, kind of thing. And there were publishers interested in textbooks as well. It was an industry, and it's a much bigger industry now. So we said our little say and went home, and then we got a letter from Mr. Chagla saying, why don't you write the textbooks? You're all professional historians. My first reaction was, I'm teaching at a university and doing my research, I'm not going to sit and write school textbooks. And then finally one was persuaded, and the persuasion was colleagues who said, look, there is a crisis, the subject is being badly taught, so why don't you put together a decent textbook which would do something to help the subject being properly taught. So I took 3 years off because I was asked to do 2 textbooks of middle schools, class 6 and 7, age 12 and 13, and I had never written for children before. And God help me, I'll never write again. It's the toughest thing. It's the toughest thing because you have to be on top of your subject and you can't talk down. You really have to be very careful. So anyway, I wrote these 2 small textbooks and tried them out in schools and chatted with school history teachers in schools and so on and put them together. And they went through a series of committees of historians, at least 2 committees, where line by line comments were made and sent to me, and I then reconsidered the comments and sometimes approved of them and sometimes said, no, this was not what I could write and so on. And then we put the books together. And in 1966, they were prescribed. And at that stage, what one thought one was doing was, one was behaving like a professional historian because one was trying to professionalize the writing of history textbooks in that sense, and that one was trying to write textbooks that were reflective of mainstream history. There were certainly not textbooks that were reflective of any particular school of history. It was mainstream accepted history. The reaction was generally positive. People said, at last we have sensible textbooks that do tell us something about the subject. But there was one body of opinion that reacted violently against what I had written. One particular statement I had made. That was the Hindutva group, or what was then the Hindutva group, the Jansang Rod, who objected to my having said that the ancient, whoever the ancient Aryans were, that they ate beef. And that it was not that they ate it regularly, but it was served on special occasions to honored guests and at sacrificial occasions. So that it was very special. But this was certainly something that was eaten, and that later on a prohibition for some groups of Indian society came into effect. They couldn't eat beef, and it was interesting to go into the question of why the prohibition came in later on. I didn't explain why the prohibition came in because that was a very complicated thing, but I thought this was enough that the child should know that such changes do take place in society and that they were important changes. But of course there was great opposition to this statement. First of all, they said there's no evidence. So I still remember the editor of a Sunday newspaper who said to me, I'm going to publish the article from the person who says that there is no evidence, and I want you to reply and give the evidence. So I quoted the Vedic texts and the archaeology, which the best of archaeologists has categorically stated that there was evidence for the eating of beef. And these 2 articles were published side by side. And next came the reply saying, yes, we know that there is evidence for the eating of beef, but it is morally wrong to tell a young child that beef was eaten. To which I replied and said that I think it's morally much more correct to tell the child that beef was eaten and then explain why there was a prohibition later on. So this is where that controversy started. And then the book was used right up until the time, and now that I think about it, it's a sort of litmus test of a certain type of Indian politics. It was used right up till the time when Mrs. Gandhi was thrown out of office after the emergency, the elections of 1977, and Morarji Desai came to power with his conglomerate of the Janata Party and the Janasangh and various other groups. And somebody spoke to Morarji Desai and said these textbooks should be banned because they're anti-Indian and they're anti-national and they talk about things like the Aryans eating beef. So a note was sent to the education minister, and somebody rang me up from the ministry and said, your book is being banned. I said, I don't believe it. So he Xeroxed a copy of the note and sent it to me, and sure enough, it said very clearly, these books must be now proscribed. So we started a public campaign in which we gave the excerpts and gave the evidence and wrote articles explaining why it was necessary that these books should continue. And for about 2-3 years, I remember every Sunday morning my mother would wake me up and say 3 letters of abuse, 2 of support, or 4 letters of support and 2 of abuse, and it just went on. Finally, we said to them, we said, look, this is not a case of you versus me, it's a case of historical knowledge. So set up a committee of historians and let a committee of historians decide whether these books are to be used as textbooks or not. And they did that. And of course the committee of historians said these books are fine, continue to use them. So the debate began to die down a little bit, but only a little. And then of course the government fell and Mrs. Gandhi came back into power. And the story that circulates in the ministry is that the books were revived not because the government fell, but because Audit and Account said that they had published 3 lakh copies and they couldn't allow them to go waste. But this may be an apocryphal story. The sad thing was that in the first time the controversy arose in Morarji Desai's government, we thought that we had created enough of a public debate for people to realize that history is not a body of information that remains unchanged, that it is a matter of interpretation, and that there are people that have different interpretations and there is an evaluation and a method involved. But obviously not, because the second time round the issue was taken up again. And I don't know whether it is still fully understood that professional history is different, and that there is a professional history, and that there are rules that one conforms to, there is a method that one uses. Anyway, so then there was a series of governments, Congress, and then later on Janata Party and so on. The books happily continued. And then came the BJP government. And of course the first thing they did was to say that these textbooks must go. They first said, till we write our own books, we will delete passages. And this was the passage that was deleted from my book. But there were various other passages deleted from all the other books that various other people had written, other historians. And there was quite a debate on this, that, you know, can you treat historians in this fashion? After all, each one of the authors of these textbooks were respectable professional historians, and can you start deleting passages from their books and also insist that those passages must not be read, must not be discussed in class? So not only did you have a deletion of the passage, but it was also considered illegal to discuss those passages in class. This went on. We carried on with our campaign for a couple of years. And we were called all kinds of abusive names, including the Minister for Education calling us academic terrorists. And then finally, they had their own textbooks ready, and those textbooks were prescribed. And it is really appalling how bad they are. Again, you know, pedagogically bad, historically uncertain, facts not correct, and that kind of thing. I mean, they cheerfully left out the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. So that's where the situation is at now. But it was again the feeling that we had, A, that the attack on the textbooks was an attack on professional historians, because they kept quoting all kinds of religious organizations that had objected. They were not quoting professional historians. It was the Arya Samaj, it was the Goraksha Samaj, it was this, it was that, and it was a variety of organizations. And the second reason, of course, was that we were frightened, and justifiably so as it turned out, that the new textbooks would be textbooks propagating, again, the Hindutva ideology, which is precisely what they do. Because history was at the base of finding a new Hindu identity for India. Without history, they couldn't clinch that identity, which is why the two areas which have been most subject to rewriting, attack, and abuse, really. One is the whole question of who were the Aryans? Were they indigenous? Can't we call the Harappans Aryans? Can't we say that the Aryans built the Harappan civilization? Because then you have an unbroken descent of 5,000 years of the Hindus from the original Aryans. A superior race, a superior culture. The Hindus are in ipso facto superior. The Muslims and the Christians are foreigners because their religion originated outside India, which was Savarkar's great thesis. So only the Hindus have claims to being the primary citizens of this country. The Muslims and Christians are foreigners, to which, of course, there has been this problem of what do you do with the Adivasis and the Dalits, because not all of them, very few of them, in fact, claim to be Hindus. They claim to be something else. So they have to also somehow be fitted in. That, and the other area which is tremendously controversial is, of course, the whole so-called Muslim period of Indian history, where the Hindutva version is that it was a period of unmitigated Hindu resistance to Muslim oppression and tyranny and conquest. Whereas many of us are arguing that these were relationships that need to be investigated, like all relationships, even from the earlier period. These were all social relationships through time, and all social relationships need to be investigated. What goes into the creation of an Indian history is bits of Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, all of this. There are people who are talking about how essential it is to write joint histories of Sri Lanka and South India, because the connections have always been so close and there's been so much toing and froing that you really can't separate them out. And there is also some talk about a few historians in Pakistan and in India maybe coming together to do some kind of an integrated history. At the moment, national history is primary. How long will it last? When eventually ideologies like Hindutva and Islamic fundamentalism and so on are overthrown, will you then have histories of a different kind, which are not so bound by the boundaries of the nation?